Hello, welcome to WNBA Swish. We are joined by a very special guest, Paul Whelan's sister, Elizabeth. How are you today?
Very good. Thanks so much for having me on.
Of course. And our friend Blake Spadaro, our contributor. Hi, Blake.
How you doing, John?
Elizabeth, if you don't mind me asking, for our viewers, can you just kind of recap how Paul got into the situation that he's in?
Absolutely. In 2018, in December, Paul went over to Moscow to help an American friend, a U.S. Marine who was marrying a Russian woman, to help with the wedding. Paul had been to Moscow a number of times, and so he was familiar with it as a tourist. And even though this Russian woman, obviously she was from Russia, but she wasn't as familiar with Moscow. Just like, if you were living in Tennessee, you might not know New York City so well. So they asked Paul to come along and help with the U.S. wedding guests that were coming over. And he said, sure, even though it was going to be Christmas time and he wouldn't be able to be with his family, he wanted to help his friend. So he went over there, and on the day of the wedding, somebody he had met and thought of as a friend in Russia showed up as unannounced at his hotel room and gave him a USB drive, saying that holiday pictures were on it from a previous visit. And 5 minutes later, the FSB, which is the modern version of the KGB, broke down the door to the hotel room and arrested Paul. And this was right before the wedding. The groom and the bride were so surprised that Paul didn't show up, and that's what sort of alerted them that something was wrong. And so that was almost 4.5 years ago. Since then, Paul, he was kept in Lefortovo prison in Moscow for 20 months. He endured, during that trial, emergency surgery at the prison, interrogations, a sham trial. And after being sentenced to 16 years at a forced labor camp on the charges of espionage, Paul is now at a camp called IK-17 in the province of Mordovia, about 8 hours away from Moscow.
It's my knowledge of it from the Brittany situation. That's the worst it can get.
It's not. It's called a harsh regime camp. And they have different tiers, and it's pretty awful. The camp itself is a remnant of the Gulag system from Stalin days. They never really stopped using them, so they're very badly deteriorated. It's just like something that you would think of out of a war movie, just that same type of look. The conditions are really bad, and since sanctions have been imposed on Russia, they're running out of food. They turned the heat off at IK-17 in mid-February this year. So they're out there with all of this snow, sub-zero temperatures, and night and day, they're having to endure this freezing cold weather. It's pretty bad. It's pretty brutal.
How does Paul get food? Does he eat food from the prison, or is there outside options that are brought to the prison? And how maybe the sanctions affect that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So it's a problem throughout all of the prisons that the prisoners don't get enough food, and it's just horrible. And so if you're a Russian and you're in prison, your family brings food to the prison so you have something to eat. Of course, that's a problem for Paul, because we're here, we can't ship food and such to him. So the U.S. Embassy actually can deliver Paul a certain amount of food, but it's only X number of pounds per quarter. So he has to, when he gets that food, he has to make it last as long as he possibly can. And there are a lot of restrictions about what can be given to him. So earlier on in his incarceration, he was able to get deliveries of fresh fruit and vegetables. The prisoners would go in together on this kind of thing. But since sanctions, that has become really difficult. And so they are really living on either whatever each one of them can have delivered, or the subsistence food from the prison. So an example that I told somebody about today was that Paul told us that they usually get borscht. It's a soup with beetroots in. And it's not the greatest thing in the world, in my opinion, but vegetables, right? But now they're actually taking the beetroot out and just serving them the warm beet water basically as the soup. So that's a good example of the kind of deprivation that is being experienced now, because of the sanctions and such. So I believe, so I say sanctions, but it's also got to do with the war on Ukraine, in my opinion, that money that might have been available to feed prisoners has been taken to help fund this war. So it's a combination of issues, I think, impacting how the prisoners are faring at the moment.
I think with the war too, Russia's known for not taking the best care of their soldiers who are basically forced in the military service, and a lot of those resources, since Moldova is so regionally close to Ukraine, kind of get transferred out that way too.
Yeah, they certainly did a lot of recruiting in the prisons to try to get people for the Wagner group, and then the Ministry of Defense stopped letting the Wagner group go in, and they started going in trying to recruit prisoners. So each time that has happened, Paul has been shunted away. They've either put him in a different part of the prison or sent him to a prison hospital that's in another small town, so that he can't see how the recruiting is done. But it's certainly, they're going to all of the prisons and they're trying to get people who are, at Paul's prison, there are a lot of foreigners. And that means not just from America, that means, from Kazakhstan and places like that. And so they're trying to get those people sent to the war rather than the people who live in Moscow. So Paul's had a chance to see firsthand, sort of how this whole thing operates.
Has Paul exhausted his appeals, for lack of a better term, in the Russian judicial system?
Oh, very good question. So Paul decided early on not to bother to appeal. And
Yeah.
we sort of, we kind of gave him that advice as well. I think he had figured it out himself. There was going to be no chance that Russia was going to let him go. Yeah, to begin with, even with their own citizens, it's something like a 99% conviction rate. If they get you in there, they'll concoct some story so that they can hold you for some time. But with Paul, the whole point of setting him up, charging him with espionage and, holding him like this was to try to extract something from the US. So no appeal was going to work. Not only that Paul's lawyer was assigned to him by the FSB. He wasn't allowed to pick his own lawyer. They did, I think the lawyers over there are in a kind of an uncomfortable situation. So they did the best they could, but there was going to be no getting out. So rather than having to go to the expense and trouble and the trauma, Paul just decided not to appeal. Now, I think that was a little different in Brittany's situation because she was not being charged with an enormous crime like espionage. And there was an opportunity perhaps that somebody would let her go. But once again, that same playbook that the Russians used, was used on her.
Unfortunate part of the situation here is that the Brittany and Paul, we'll call it that, situation gets politicized.
Yeah.
And there are a lot of people that hold the view that Paul was abandoned by the administration and that your family might have some resentment that she was brought back and not him. I don't know if you want to clear that up.
Absolutely. Gosh, this has been driving me crazy. So, it's so difficult when Brittany was first arrested, my heart just went out to her because I knew what was going to happen. I could just see it. I was just seeing the Kremlin go, oh, we've got this great prize. We can cause a lot of trouble in the US with this person. We're going to, do what we can. So I knew she'd end up being declared wrongfully detained at some point, although I think there was some effort to try to get her out of there before they had to go to that point. I often tell families, you actually don't want to become a SPIHA case because once you're, and that's the Special Presidential Envoy for Hostage Affairs, we call it SPIHA. So once you're wrongfully detained, that's the group of people helping you. But it means that you're in a transactional situation whereby you're just waiting for an agreement for some kind of trade. You actually want to have diplomatic things done to get you out of there before that sort of thing happens. Right. But once we saw this whole thing start to go on, the media sensationalism around Brittany, who is obviously a much better known person than my brother, was crazy. I mean, we had worked so hard to try to get any sort of media attention for Paul. And all of a sudden it was like a freight train that just ran Paul over. He was barely being mentioned in articles, and yet he had gone through all of this trauma for a couple of years by then, as had Trevor Reed, another American who was held over there. So I mean, we were pretty distraught. We had just gone through the whole situation of having Trevor come home without Paul. And that was a deal where a lot of us, including, I think, the State Department, really thought there was an opportunity to get both of them back. And we were not told, our family was not told until about half an hour before the news of Trevor being released, was announced. And it really blindsided us. So we were, here we could see with Brittany, here came the opportunity for yet another scenario where Paul was not able to come home. Now, we knew that the administration was not leaving Paul behind on purpose, that this was the Russians playing it. But at the same time, we wanted the administration to be smarter than the Russians and to figure this out and not to let, this happen. So we realized there was going to be a partisanship problem. Basically, as soon as I got the news on Twitter, always a bad place to get the news, that the vice president and president had called Sherelle and, to commiserate. And I kind of had a meltdown on Twitter going, where's the phone call for the Whelans? We're not celebrities. Why are we not getting, calls? This is unfair, blah, blah, blah. And my brother David got in touch with me and he goes, oh no, he goes, the media is trying to make this you guys versus the Griners. And I was, and all of that, which camp each person should be in and pitting them against each other. So David and I immediately got out there and said, hey, we want Brittany home as well. This isn't an either or thing. We want them both home, but we also want equal treatment. If the president and the vice president are going to call one family, there are 50-something people being wrongfully detained. All of their families should get a phone call. We're just asking for, equitable treatment. And from that point on, we made a big effort. We could see the horrible, horrible comments in Twitter, the partisanship, I mean, to this day, it's still going on, and it just kills me every time I see it. So we made a point of always mentioning that Brittany should come home. When Brittany did come home and Paul did not, we tried to do what we could to tell people this is Russia trying to play us. They weren't going to give President Biden the win of having both Brittany and Paul come home at the same time. But what we want is we want this administration to get the upper hand on this situation. We don't want to see Paul left behind a third time. It wasn't as if President Biden, sort of like tossed a coin and said, okay, we're bringing Brittany home and not Paul. And people tend to treat it like that because they're refusing to understand that the bad guy isn't in our White House. The bad guy is in the Kremlin. And that's where we have to focus our attention. These are the people who are screwing with us by wrongfully detaining Americans.
Russia kind of gives this BS release about the process they use to authorize prisoner exchanges, but it's my background's in politics too, so I kind of have a little base knowledge.
Yeah.
It's President Putin that authorizes any prisoner exchange. And it doesn't, if you're being a fair trading partner, it doesn't take a year, 2 years, 5 or 1,607, is that it, days? To say, okay, we want this person in exchange for this person.
Yeah, I think it was this last year, Russia pulled themselves out of the Council of Europe, and that prisoner exchange treaty was something under the Council of Europe. And so they no longer, it doesn't even really exist as a mechanism at this point. Now, Russia makes up rules to suit themselves whenever they want to. So if Putin wanted to authorize a special prisoner transfer, he could do it, My feeling is at this point, Paul Whelan is one of the few things that Russia has over us. It's one of the few things. And now there's Evan Gershkovich as well. But this business of hostage taking like this, it's obvious how weak the Kremlin is if this is how they have to work. But it is the only place where we have not been able to manage to get the upper hand. We've made trades to bring Americans home, and I think that's great. Any American is worth more than some Russian criminal. But obviously, this continuing to hold Paul while bringing other people home, because it could potentially happen again with Evan. It's starting to get on my nerves.
Had any, or your family had any contact with Governor Richardson or Bill Richardson, anyone like that? Because I know he's involved a lot on the side in trying to do these things.
Yeah, mostly at the beginning of this, we engaged the Richardson Center to help us in DC because during the Trump administration, we were having a very difficult time getting anyone to speak out and to do anything, to really make a trade or to do anything to get Paul home. We were getting great support from the State Department, and the embassy in Moscow was amazing. And they really helped everyone through it. But we needed to understand a little bit more how to navigate in DC. And so we had a number of people who were helping us, and the Richardson Center was one of those. They were more involved, I think, in getting, in talking to the Russians about Trevor Reed and about Brittany, and less so about my brother Paul. So right now we're really working pretty directly with the National Security Council and the State Department, and their efforts. And my job as Paul's sister, I feel it's sort of my duty to prod them along. I'm the cattle prod behind their efforts.
If you don't mind me asking, you had a meeting with President Biden in the Oval Office.
Yeah.
How did that go? If you're able to say what was said and if you felt he was being sincere with you?
Sure, that was a really amazing week. I had come down to actually talk at a task force that the House had started on detainee affairs, and some previously held wrongful detainees were there, and other things were going on. And suddenly I get this, I had just asked, hey, could I meet with someone at the White House? Because I do that all the time. And suddenly, yes, you can meet with President Biden on Friday. And I found out that Sherelle had also been asked to come and meet. And I think that they had hoped for better news that week. I think the reason why I was being asked to come in wasn't just for a general chat. It was really, they thought that there was something going on, but unfortunately it didn't happen. And yet they were kind of stuck. They sort of had to meet us anyway, because I'm sure that Sherelle felt the same way that I did. If they all of a sudden had canceled that, we would have been out there in the media going, what's going on? But I have to say, it was an impressive meeting. The president is super sharp. He has an understanding, a very broad understanding of how Russia operates in this space. Jake Sullivan was in the meeting as well. And I won't go into the details of what we spoke about, but
Sure.
it was a very candid talk about where we were. I had some ideas, a little crazy maybe, that I wanted to throw in there, and they were open to me telling them what those were. I had his sincerity was absolute. I mean, there's no doubt. But this is a huge problem. People think, oh, all I've got to do is get in there and talk to the president, and all of a sudden the problem is solved.
Yeah.
But it isn't, because the other people are holding the key. Russia is the one that's keeping Paul, and they can continue to keep him no matter what we do. We have to find that leverage that is strong enough that whatever we did would embarrass the White House, or it would pressure, not the White House, the Kremlin, or it would pressure them in some way, or it would escalate the situation to a point where the Kremlin felt they had to say, let Paul go. And I don't know what the answer to that is. I'm not well enough aware of what's going on behind the scenes to know what that is. But I felt that the meeting was good and was productive, but it doesn't solve things. It's good to meet with the president. It doesn't bring your person home.
Can all agree the key to it lies with one person, and one person alone, who enjoys toying with people's emotions, for lack of a better term.
That's super accurate. Mm-hmm.
Have you had contact with Paul and been able to speak to him directly other than letters?
I haven't personally, but he is able to talk to my parents most days of the week in very short phone calls. It's something that it's so odd, because the prison follows its own rules to the letter when it feels like. So one of those things is prisoners are allowed to make calls for X number of minutes a day. And so Paul is allowed to call my parents, and he is allowed to call the US Embassy. And that is basically it. Now, he has managed a couple of times to get, I think via the US Embassy perhaps, to get calls to other people. So he was able to call a CNN reporter this past weekend. He usually gets in trouble when that happens, so it's done at great risk. But he does have regular calls with my folks. And so he can pass information or messages to me, to David, to our other brother, Andrew, for us to send on to the State Department or whatever, if something's going on or he wants people to know information. So it's some sanity for him. It's some connection back to Michigan, which is where my parents live. And some way of keeping in touch with what's going on in America, because of course on the news, especially now, all he gets is the Russian state news. They've kicked out all the independent reporters and all of that sort of thing. So he's getting his ears filled with all of the propaganda that they're putting on TV over there.
How's your parents doing, if I may ask?
Well, they're hanging in there. This is not easy for them. They're in their mid 80s, and it's a lot to have, regular phone calls with your youngest son who's being wrongfully detained in a Russian, prison camp. I mean, it overwhelms them at times, but I think they've got to a point where they realize their role. My role is to go to DC and advocate. Our brother David is our family spokesman. Andrew handles Paul's personal affairs and things so that his life isn't a shambles when he gets home. My parents have decided that their role is trying to keep Paul's spirits up and be this conduit for information. But it's absolutely all they can manage, and it's a real strain on them. Yeah, it's hard to describe. I think, at the beginning of this, I was put in touch with a couple of family members of people who had come home, the sister of Amir Hekmati, who had been held in Iran, and another, a mother of another person who had been detained. And both of them told me how this changes families. It changes them forever. It changes people forever. And the longer it goes on, the more that is the case. And I have seen it in our own family.
Beyond unfortunate, and we in the WNBA community only got a little bit of a moderate taste of what that's like, and even for us, it was a pure torture. This cloud of weight hanging over you every day. Is every time your phone rings, is this a call about that, or
Yeah.
stuff like that. And we just opened our season a few days ago, and
Yeah, I saw that.
it, believe me, the feeling was very different.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because we're so used in this country to being able to solve problems in some way. There's always some way to solve a problem. It might not be easy, it might take a while, but we can usually get there. We call it the land of opportunity. It doesn't mean things fall in your lap, but it does mean that, often, even if you're protesting something or whatever it happens to be, there are ways to deal with problems. When suddenly an American is taken overseas by another country who simply isn't going to let them go, all of a sudden you hit a brick wall on that. And it's very difficult to figure out. We can't use our normal, gung-ho attitude. It just doesn't work. And I saw the entire, the WNBA, the Griner team, so to speak, kind of hitting those same walls that we'd also hit. And we tried as much as we could behind the scenes to sort of send information and say, yeah, this is what you can expect in the trial. This is what might happen, after the trial. Just not saying this is what you ought to do, but here are some experiences that we've gone through just so that you're prepared for them, because it's so different. The court system is so different. The setup is so different, and it's been extraordinary to see Brittany want to come out in public and help the families the way that she is so soon after coming home. I mean, I don't know what kind of strength that takes, but it's extraordinary. And I've been, when you were talking about the partisanship and stuff earlier, a lot of people I see on Twitter saying, well, it's the least she can do, blah, blah, blah. And my view is no returning American detainee owes anybody anything. You do not owe the other detainees, you do not owe anybody except your own recovery. And so the fact that she is not only going, processing what she went through, but also getting out there publicly to talk about and help other detainee families is, above and beyond. It's extremely courageous.
If it might be some small consolation to you and your family. She just had, I think, 2 or 3 games, 27 points. Just amazing performance, the strength you're talking about. That same strength, I can promise you she will put into keeping his name out there, keeping this cause out there, and doing whatever's in her power to influence the powers that be. And she doesn't let up on the gas pedal.
Well, that's real. I mean, that's kind. And my hope in return, I mean, I thank her so much for that, but my hope in return is that I'm very cognizant, our whole family is very cognizant, is of the every time she is out there talking about Paul, it brings out the trolls. We understand that. Every time she talks about her experience in Russia, it brings out the trolls. You know, if there's ever a time when she's just going, hey, I just need a break from that. You know, I mean, yeah, I've advocated for a while and I may in the future, but I just need to kind of, you know, there's no one who will not understand that. I mean, we will all understand that because it's, you know, I think when detainees come back, some of them more than others find themselves in the public eye in a way they never were before. They find out that the media has dissected their lives, has cherry picked, you know, things to talk about, and tried to make that all of who this person is. So somebody, even a celebrity like Britney, who's had a, you know, she's been out there in the public, but she still had a private life. All of a sudden, all of that's decimated. And I totally understand anybody who would want to go, hey, I need to regroup and protect that. Because the onslaught of people who really don't care and they're just using you kind of as a brick bat to hit somebody else with, it's pretty bad. And so, you know, once again, her courage in speaking out for people. And that includes people not held in Russia. You know, Russia's had a lot of attention because Putin is, well, I can't probably say that what I really think he is, but he is. And yet there are all these people held in China, you know, in Syria, Venezuela, all of these other countries not getting as much attention. And Brittany is helping shed a light on everyone. And that's super, I mean, that's just wonderful.
You know, for our viewers out there, you know, they see Brittany talk about Paul, they see his face on the news, and you know, he is a symbol. Who is he as a person? What do you miss most about your brother? You know, just kind of humanize him a little bit for us, if you don't
Yeah,
mind.
you know, people always ask me that. Like, you know, you never really know. Like we've joked around in our family. David has said, if you know, if you're going to leave the country, especially if you're going a place like Russia, you know, make sure you've got a whole bunch of photos that your family can use. Make sure that you know that we have a bio of what you'd like us to say about you. Well, Paul's got a really good sense of humor, and he is a kind of person who's taken a lot of good care. Like, for example, of my parents, he would go see them regularly, make sure the house was set up safely for them. He's super safety conscious. You know, he was a corporate security director before all of this happened, and physical plant security, that kind of thing, you know. And so he would kind of treat my parents' house, make sure they had everything just right so that they wouldn't hurt themselves or whatever. But I think that kind of, you know, caring, that sort of like looking out for his friends, looking out for his family, that's what got him in this mess. That's what got him to Moscow, helping out his friend, you know, was that willingness to do that sort of thing. And our family, we're not like close in the sense of like all up in each other's business. You know, as we became adults, you know, we live very far apart from each other, but we've always sort of had an affectionate feeling towards each other, you know, loose communication. And Paul would communicate a lot with me and my folks. I think because I'm the oldest and he's the youngest, he kind of considered me one of the seniors. So when he would go on trips, for example, he'd take pictures of like what he's eating and, you know, email the three of us so that we knew what he was up to. That's one of the reasons we knew something was wrong, because we stopped getting these emails from him when he was in Russia. But it's, you know, it's hard to sort of characterize, you know, I don't know who Paul is now. I think that's the thing, that I don't know what he looks like. You know, we haven't seen a photo of him since his hearing. The pictures and such that we put up, those are pictures of the Paul from before, the Paul that was the corporate security director. You know, he tells us he's lost a lot of weight, that is, you know, his hair has turned white. It's hard to it's hard to know. It's hard to know how this experience will have changed him. So, you know, it's quite the ordeal for everyone concerned. And I'm sure that Brittany and her family went through, you know, something equivalent.
How can we support your brother?
Oh gosh, I mean, just the fact that we can tell him about all of this support, I mean, it's really helpful. That, you know, it's just great for him to know, you know, I can tell him that, you know, I was on this podcast and that sort of thing. I think writing to Paul is super important. We're having a lot of trouble getting the mail to him. He is getting it, but he's getting it months late. It's just something that the Russian prisons have always done. But what's useful is the mail is going via the State Department to the U.S. Embassy, and they're the ones trying to get it to Paul. And they're seeing all of this support. It reminds them every time another bunch of mail comes in. You know, they sent us a picture sometime around Christmas when I think Brittany had put up on Instagram, everybody write Paul Whelan. And they sent me a photo of all of this mail over this table. I mean, it was extraordinary. And then a few days later, they said another pile of it had come. And I mean, they were just blown away. But it underscores, with everything else going on, the fact that, you know, that there's a support for Paul. And then when the mail finally does get to Paul, of course, I mean, he loves it. All of these people, he doesn't even know who they are. They know and care about him. So I would say that that is sort of number one. And then the other thing, of course, is just to continue, you know, anything that you can with members of Congress, your representative, saying, hey, you still remember and care about Paul Whelan coming home, and you want to make sure that your member of Congress is doing something about that. Now, we've got a lot of good support, but you know how it is. The next bright, shiny object comes along and everybody, you know, gets distracted. So we have to keep reminding them on a regular basis, you know, hey, don't forget about that guy in Russia.
And on our website, WNBAswish.com, we have links to your website for Free Paul Whelan. Is that it?
Yep.
We have links to where to write him. We have links to where to donate to help him, you know, with his funds. That's real important because he needs that money to buy, you know, what, food and just basic toiletries and supplies.
Yeah, I can talk about that for just a second. So people know 100% of any funds donated to the GoFundMe goes directly to support Paul. He is not allowed to have the money himself in the prison. You can imagine the prison doesn't want the prisoners to have money. So what we do is we send the money in such a way through the State Department that they can put it in a prison account for him to use. If there are things, they have a small, you'd call it a commissary of sorts, where he can get, you know, paper, stamps, things like that, that he can use for writing. They used to have food items. I'm not sure if they do still, but that money also is used by the embassy to buy the food for Paul, because we can't ship it from the US. They actually literally shop for him in Moscow and then deliver that food down to Mordovia, do the 8-hour drive to get it to him. And then Paul needed some dental work, you know, some emergency dental work last year. So the funds were used for that. It pays for his phone cards to make the phone calls to the embassy and to my parents. So that money is really important to keep Paul going. It's what our family wouldn't be able to do. All the trips I make to DC, I do out of my own resources. My other brothers, you know, the bits they do, they use their own resources. So that GoFundMe is only for Paul, only to support him. And I'm clear, I want to be clear on that because I think it's important that people understand where the money goes.
Absolutely.
But I want to say thank you to you and to everybody who has been supporting Brittany and understanding and learning, you know, what wrongful detention is all about, helping support her, you know, now that she's back, and who have turned some of that support to help Paul and everyone else who's wrongfully detained. We appreciate it more than we can ever express. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. It's been wonderful to speak with you this evening.
Of course. And we want to thank you, Elizabeth Whelan, again for joining us, and, you know, all our love and prayers to your family.
Thank you.